A few months later, the new airliner flew all the way to the United States for another state visit, marking the first ever transatlantic crossing by a jet airliner. For the Soviets, the 104 was a huge propaganda win, and quickly developing it out of a bomber seemed like a masterstroke of genius. But the first signs of trouble were already beginning to appear. Compared to other airliners, the Tu-104 was a handful to fly. Pilots complained about heavy, unresponsive controls, and the aircraft's enormous weight and highly swept wings made low-speed flying particularly challenging. Landing at busy civilian airports was a white-knuckle affair. Pilots were so afraid of stalling, it was common practice to land the plane at higher speeds than designed. Stopping was another issue. The airliner had no air brakes, no thrust reversers, and a weak set of wheel brakes. A hastily deployed parachute was often the only thing that kept the airliner from continuing past the runway. But the complaints were brushed off by Soviet authorities. That is, until 1958, when the airliner began exhibiting behaviors that were impossible to ignore. The first sign of trouble came in February, when a CSA-104 flew into turbulence, which caused both engines to flame out. Without power, the aircraft fell 20,000 feet before the frantic pilots managed to relight the engines. A month later, another 104 ran into turbulent weather, but this time the aircraft was hurled up into the sky, and the pilots couldn't stop it from climbing, all the way up to 44,000 feet, higher than the plane should ever fly. Eventually, the aircraft stalled and began tumbling back to Earth before the pilots managed to regain control. Despite the near disasters, Soviet authorities were quick to blame the pilots. But the incidents continued. In August, another 104 was mysteriously hurled up into the sky. Again, the aircraft stalled, but this time the pilots couldn't recover, and tragically, there were no survivors. Just 2 months later, a 104 flying between Beijing and Moscow was once again hurled up into the sky. This time, the pilot heroically radioed back details as they were happening. While he couldn't save the aircraft, the information radioed back would prove pivotal. Authorities could no longer ignore the bizarre series of accidents. There was clearly something wrong with the plane. But remarkably, they wouldn't ground the aircraft, instead letting it continue carrying passengers while they were still working to uncover the mystery. Eventually, investigators would come to realize that the cause was powerful updrafts that the pilots couldn't counteract, and the aircraft's bomber-derived origins were at least partly to blame. The 104's larger pressurized cabin was prone to having its center of gravity shifted rearward, depending on how the aircraft was loaded. This meant that there was a natural tendency to pitch upwards in an updraft, and the aircraft wasn't powerful enough to counteract these forces, leaving the pilots helpless. A number of emergency modifications were made, and the aircraft was restricted from flying above a certain altitude. But not before another incident in 1959, when another 104 hit an updraft before the pilots managed to recover. A critical design flaw had cost 144 lives. And although fixes were made, the aircraft would still go on to earn an extensive rap sheet of other accidents. The most common were runway overshoots, thanks to the tricky nature of flying the heavy bomber-derived airliner. Nearly 1 out of every 5 Tu-104 that was built would end up destroyed in accidents. But given the secretive nature of the Soviet Union, these incidents received little news coverage. Even so, the airliner developed a notorious reputation amongst the traveling public, even becoming the theme of a 1960s folk song.